Throwaway account. I'm 36M, my partner is 34F. Together almost 6 years. We met when I was coming out of a rough period in my life. Career instability, low confidence, the usual mess you tell yourself love will fix. She was confident, articulate, sharp. I admired that about her. I still do in some ways. From the beginning, she was very honest. Brutally honest, she liked to say. If I wore something she didn't like, she'd tell me it didn't suit me. If I told a story awkwardly in front of friends, she'd correct details afterward. If I made a decision she wouldn't have made, she'd explain, calmly, why it wasn't the best choice. I told myself this was growth, that I needed someone who'd challenge me, someone who wouldn't just nod along and let me stay mediocre. When I get defensive, she'd say, I'm not attacking you, I'm just being honest. That phrase became her shield. The first time it really stuck with me was after a dinner with friends. On the drive home, she listed everything I'd done wrong, interrupting, joking too much, talking about work. I laughed it off, but later that night, I replayed the evening in my head, wondering if everyone else had noticed the same things. She kissed me goodnight and said, I just want you to be the best version of yourself. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have someone who cared enough to be honest. I didn't realize yet that constant critique, even when delivered calmly, doesn't build you up, it trains you to doubt yourself. After that night, I started noticing how often I was being reviewed, not criticized outright, assessed. Like my life was a project she was managing. She'd comment on how I phrased emails, how I handled conversations with my boss, how long it took me to make decisions, always calmly, always framed as help. If I pushed back, she'd tilt her head and say, Why are you taking this personally? That question worked every time. It made me feel immature for reacting at all. So I learned to nod, to thank her, to adjust. The twist was how one-sided it all was. She rarely asked what I thought she could improve. If I did offer feedback, she'd get quiet and say she felt attacked. Apparently, honesty only flowed one way. I told myself that was just our dynamic. She was the strong one, the grounded one. I was still finding my footing. Slowly, I stopped trusting my instincts. I'd catch myself pausing before speaking, mentally checking how she might correct me later. I'd second-guess choices I used to make easily. Even small things, ordering food, telling stories, started to feel like tests. One night, I mentioned considering a job change. She listened, then said, I don't think you're ready for that yet. Not cruelly, matter of fact, like she was stating a fact about the weather. I nodded, even though part of me felt deflated. Later, alone, I realized something unsettling. I'd started seeing myself through her eyes more than my own. And without ever raising her voice, she'd quietly become the authority on who I was, and who I was allowed to be. The moment of clarity came from something embarrassingly small. We were standing in a grocery store, staring at a shelf of pasta sauces. I reached for one I liked without thinking. She stopped me and said, That one's not great. It's too acidic. Then she added, You usually don't like that kind anyway. I paused, hands still in the air, confused. I did like that kind. Or at least I used to. I put it back and grabbed the one she suggested. She smiled, satisfied, and moved on. That should have been nothing. But it followed me home. I realized how often that exact moment happened. Me reaching, her correcting, me adjusting. Not just with groceries. With opinions, plans, reactions. I'd stopped trusting my own preferences because they were always being refined, optimized, improved by someone who seemed so sure. The twist was recognizing how anxious I felt making decisions when she wasn't around. I'd open my phone, ready to text and ask what she thought, then stop myself. Why did I need permission for such ordinary things? That night, she asked why I seemed quiet. I almost told her the truth. Instead, I said I was tired. She nodded approvingly, like that answer made sense. Lying in bed, I felt a slow, heavy realization settle in. I wasn't being guided anymore. I was being shaped. And the scariest part wasn't that she had opinions. It was that I'd learned to silence my own before she ever had to. A few weeks after the grocery store incident, I decided, quietly, that I was going to make one decision without running it by her first. Nothing big, low stakes. I told myself it was just an experiment. A friend invited me to a small get-together on a Friday night. Normally, I'd mention to her immediately, wait for the subtle pause, the follow-up questions, the eventual assessment of whether it was worth it. This time, I said yes first. Then I told her later, casually, like it was already settled. Her reaction was instant, even though her voice stayed calm. "Oh, I didn't realize you want to do that. Not can you? Not have fun. Just surprise laced with disapproval." She asked who would be there, how late it would go, why it mattered to me. Each question felt like a small tug backward. I felt myself shrinking, ready to justify, to explain why I deserved this tiny choice. That was a twist. I caught it happening in real time. Instead of answering everything, I said, "I just want to see my friend." She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I just don't want you making choices that don't serve you." It sounded caring, reasonable, and yet it carried an unspoken message. I know what serves you better than you do. I went anyway. The night was fine, normal. I laughed, talked, felt lighter than I had in a while. When I came home, she was quiet, not angry, disappointed. Lying in bed, I realized something important. Trust in myself felt relieving, but it also came with consequences. Not punishment exactly, withdrawal. And I understood then why I'd stopped doing it. Because every step toward myself felt like a step away from her approval. After that night, her tone changed just enough to notice. Still calm, still measured, but sharper around the edges. The feedback kept coming, but now it carried something extra: impatience. Like she was tired of explaining things I should have already learned by now. If I hesitated during conversation, she'd finish my sentences. If I told a story, she'd correct the wording midway. Once, after I shared an idea I was genuinely excited about, she paused and said, "I don't think you've really thought that through." No questions, no curiosity, just a verdict. The twist was how often she compared me to people she admired, to colleagues she respected, to some abstract better version of who I could be. Someone more confident would have handled that differently. Most people wouldn't struggle with this. Each comment landed softly, but together they formed a steady drumbeat. "You're behind." I started noticing the look on her face when I disagreed. Not anger, disbelief, like she couldn't understand how I didn't see what was so obvious to her. That look hurt more than criticism. It made me feel small, defective. One evening, she said, "I feel like I'm always the adult in this relationship." She said it casually, like an observation. I laughed weakly, but later the sentence echoed in my head. If she was the adult, what did that make me? That night, lying awake, I finally named the feeling I'd been avoiding. It wasn't motivation. It wasn't growth. It was shame. And it was quietly reshaping how I saw myself, one helpful comment at a time. Once I recognized the shame, I started hearing it everywhere, even when she wasn't talking. That was the scariest part. I'd catch myself editing my thoughts before they reached my mouth. I'd stop mid-sentence, anticipating how she might rephrase it better. Her voice had become the filter through which I experienced myself. The twist came when I realized she didn't have to criticize me anymore. I was doing it for her. If I messed up at work, I'd think, she's going to say this proves I'm not ready. If I felt excited about something, I'd temper it, already imagining her skepticism. I wasn't reacting to her feedback anymore. I was preempting it. The evaluation had moved inside my head. One night, she asked why I seemed so quiet lately. I almost said, "I'm just thinking." What I meant was, I'm measuring myself. I didn't want to give her another opportunity to point out what I was doing wrong. Later that week, I overheard myself apologizing for something that didn't need an apology. The words came out automatically. She nodded, satisfied, and moved on. That's when I felt it clearly, not anger, not sadness, but a deep unease. I wasn't growing. I was shrinking. And the most uncomfortable truth was this. Even if she stopped criticizing me tomorrow, the damage had already been done. I'd learned to see myself as perpetually lacking. That night, Lying in bed, I asked a question I'd avoided for years. Who was I before I needed her approval to feel okay? The shift happened during an argument that wasn't really an argument at all. I'd had a rough day at work. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those days where you feel behind no matter how hard you try. I mentioned it casually, hoping for a little empathy. She listened, nodded, then said, "Maybe if you were more decisive, things like this wouldn't keep happening." She said it calmly, almost gently, and for the first time, it didn't land as advice. It landed as cruelty. That was a twist. The words hadn't changed. My ability to hear them had. I suddenly felt this sharp clarity, like a fog lifting. I realized how often my vulnerability had been met not with comfort, but with correction. How my struggles were treated as evidence of flaw instead of moments where I needed support. I told her that hurt, not angrily, just honestly. She looked surprised and slightly annoyed and said, "I'm not responsible for how you interpret things." That sentence hit harder than anything else she'd said. It meant there was no room for my feelings in the conversation. Only her intent mattered. I stopped explaining myself after that. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I just grew quieter. And in that quiet, something important happened. Without constant commentary, I could finally hear my own thoughts again. They weren't confident yet, but they were there. That night, I realized I wasn't sensitive or insecure for feeling diminished. I was responding normally to a relationship that had slowly trained me to see myself as a problem to be fixed. And once you name something accurately, it becomes very hard to unsee it. After that conversation, I stopped offering pieces of myself for review, not as a strategy, more like a reflex. I shared less about my day. I kept my excitement contained. I answered questions, but briefly. It wasn't punishment. It was self-protection. She noticed almost immediately. She asked why I was so quiet lately. Said I felt distant. Said she missed our deep talks. The irony was heavy. Those talks had never really been conversations. They were evaluations with footnotes. I didn't know how to explain that without opening myself up to more analysis. So I didn't. The twist came when she tried to pull me back in with reassurance. She said she only pushed me because she believed in my potential, that she wouldn't bother if she didn't care. Hearing it framed that way made something click. My worth in the relationship seemed tied to how much she could improve me. If I didn't need fixing, where did that leave her? I started paying attention to how calm I felt when she wasn't around. The tension in my chest eased. My thoughts flowed more freely. I laughed easier with friends. Then I'd come home and feel myself tighten again, like bracing for impact, even on good days. One evening, she said, "You've changed. You used to want my input." I almost said I used to need it. Instead, I said nothing. In that silence, I realized something important. I wasn't pulling away because I didn't care. I was pulling away because staying fully present required me to keep shrinking, and I was running out of room. That's when I understood the quiet wasn't the problem. It was the warning. The clarity didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, small enough to ignore if I wanted to, but this time I didn't. One evening, we were getting ready to go out, and I mentioned an idea for a side project I'd been thinking about. I wasn't asking for feedback. I was just sharing something that excited me. She paused, looked at me, and said, "I don't think that's realistic for you." Not the idea. For you. That distinction landed hard. I asked what she meant. She sighed and said she just didn't want me setting myself up for disappointment, that I tended to overestimate my abilities. She said it like she was protecting me from myself. And for the first time, I didn't argue. I just listened. And in listening, I saw the pattern stretch all the way back to the beginning. Every critique had the same shape. It wasn't about helping me succeed. It was about keeping me manageable, predictable, dependent. If I doubted myself, I leaned on her. If I needed her perspective, she stayed central. My insecurity wasn't an accident. It was a feature. The twist was realizing how much I had confused familiarity with safety. I thought the tightness I felt around her was love, that the constant self-monitoring meant I cared. But love doesn't make you feel like a draft that needs editing before it allowed into the room. That night, lying in bed, I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. And once you're awake to a pattern like that, you can't go back to sleep pretending it isn't there. The next change I made was small, but it felt enormous. I stopped asking what she thought before I decided things. Not everything, just the everyday stuff. What to order, how to respond to an email, whether an idea was good enough. I didn't announce it. I just did it. She noticed. "Why didn't you run that by me?" she asked one evening, not accusatory, just surprised. I shrugged and said I'd already decided. The room went quiet. Not tense, confused, like she was trying to locate a role she'd suddenly misplaced. The twist came in how she reacted afterward. She didn't criticize the decision itself. She questioned my judgment for making it alone. "I just don't understand why you wouldn't want input," she said, as if autonomy was a rejection, not a normal boundary. I realized then how deeply intertwined my independence had become with her sense of importance. If I didn't need her guidance, what was her place? That wasn't my responsibility, but I'd been carrying it anyway. That night, I felt something unfamiliar, but grounding. Confidence. Not loud, not defiant. Just the quiet assurance that I could trust myself without permission. It scared me a little, which told me how long it had been suppressed. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to be the best version of myself for her. I was just being myself. And that simple shift changed everything that followed. The more I trusted myself, the more unsettled she became. She didn't explode. She worried, asked if I was okay, if something was going on with me, if I was feeling distant. Each question sounded caring on the surface, but together they felt like an audit, checking whether I drifted too far from the version of me she understood. The twist was how quickly concern turned into correction. When I shared a win at work, she nodded and said, "That's good. Just don't get ahead of yourself." When I talked about feeling more confident lately, she smiled thinly and said, "Confidence is good, but arrogance can sneak up on people." It felt like she was trying to reinsert the old limits, gently, carefully, so I wouldn't notice. I noticed. One evening, she asked if I still valued her opinion. The question was loaded, and we both knew it. I said yes, but that I didn't need it for every decision. Her face tightened just slightly. She said she felt like she was becoming irrelevant in my life. That word, irrelevant, told me everything. My growth wasn't being celebrated. It was being experienced as loss. And I realized how much of our relationship had been built on my uncertainty. When I stopped doubting myself, the balance shifted. That night, I lay awake thinking about how often love is confused with being needed. How being indispensable can feel like intimacy, even when it's quietly eroding you. I understood then that this wasn't about communication styles or honesty anymore. It was about whether I was allowed to grow without shrinking her place in the world. The moment didn't come with fireworks. It came during an ordinary conversation, which somehow made it heavier. I was telling her about a decision I'd made at work, something I was genuinely proud of. I explained my reasoning, my plan, how it felt right. She listened, then started to speak. I interrupted her. Not rudely, not loudly. I just said, "I've already decided, and I feel good about it." The word surprised both of us. She went quiet, not reflective quiet, disarmed quiet. Then she said, "I'm just trying to help." That familiar phrase. For the first time, I didn't argue with it. I didn't explain why it wasn't helping. I didn't soften the moment. I just nodded and said, "I know." The twist was what happened next. She looked lost, like she'd reached for a lever that used to work, and found it disconnected. I realized how much of our dynamic depended on her being the final authority. When that role disappeared, there was nothing underneath it. No curiosity, no support, just uncertainty. Later that night, she asked if I was pushing her away. I told her the truth. I was pulling myself back. The difference mattered. Saying it out loud felt grounding, like claiming territory I'd abandoned for years. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad. Sad for how long it took me to trust my own voice again. Sad for the version of me that thought constant critique was love. But underneath the sadness was something steadier than fear. Relief. And I knew that once you choose your own voice, you can't go back to living quietly inside someone else's. After I started choosing my own voice, the atmosphere changed. Not overnight, but noticeably. She became less critical on the surface and more resistant underneath. Conversations felt heavier, like everything had an undertone I couldn't quite ignore. The twist came in how she framed her resistance. She didn't say, "I don't like this." She said things like, "I just miss how close we used to be," or "It feels like you don't need me anymore." Those statements carried guilt instead of blame, which somehow felt harder to push back against. Wanting autonomy was suddenly framed as emotional abandonment. I tried to reassure her, without undoing myself. I told her I still cared, that I valued her, that this wasn't about leaving her behind. But every reassurance seemed to feed the same fear, that if I didn't rely on her judgment, her place in my life would shrink. I noticed how tense she got when I sounded confident, how she'd change the subject when I talked about things I was proud of. Once, after I shared a small win, she said, "Just be careful not to get too comfortable." The comment was subtle, but familiar, a reminder of the old hierarchy trying to reassert itself. That's when it hit me. My growth wasn't neutral. It was destabilizing something that had been built on imbalance. And as uncomfortable as that was, it wasn't wrong. One evening, she asked, "Do you even want my input anymore?" I answered honestly, "Sometimes, just not automatically." Her silence after that said more than any critique ever had, because for the first time, I wasn't being evaluated. I was being resisted. And that told me everything I needed to know about what this relationship had been resting on all along. The more I stayed grounded, the more obvious the mismatch became. Not between our personalities, but between what the relationship required and who I was becoming. My confidence didn't spark curiosity in her. It created friction, like a piece that no longer fit the shape she'd grown used to. The twist came during a dinner with friends. I told a story, animated, comfortable, not checking myself mid-sentence. I felt present. Afterward, in the car, she was quiet. Then she said, "You were kind of a lot tonight." Not angry, just disappointed. Like I'd overstepped without knowing the rules had changed again. I asked what she meant. She said I'd dominated the conversation, that I'd seemed performative, that it wasn't like me. That last part hurt the most, because it was like me, or at least like the version of me that existed before everything was filtered. I realized then how narrow my role had become. I could be thoughtful, but not assertive, insightful, but not confident, improved, but never enough to outgrow the version of me she was comfortable guiding. That night, lying awake, I didn't feel angry at her. I felt sad for both of us, because her sense of closeness depended on me staying smaller, and my sense of wholeness depended on growing. Those two things couldn't coexist forever. And for the first time, I didn't wonder how to explain that to her. I wondered how much longer I could ignore it without losing myself again. The end didn't come with shouting or accusations. It came quietly, the way most realizations do once you stop arguing with them. I told her I needed time apart, not to punish her, not to make a point, just because I couldn't keep becoming smaller to make the relationship feel stable. She was shocked. Truly, she said she'd only ever tried to help me, that she believed in my potential more than anyone else. I didn't argue with that. I just told her I couldn't keep living in a relationship where I only felt valued when I was being corrected. Packing my things felt strange, like dismantling a version of myself I'd outgrown. As I left, she asked if I'd regret walking away from someone who pushed me to be better. I didn't answer right away. Later, I realized the answer was simple. Growth that comes from constant critique isn't growth. It's survival. In the weeks after, something unexpected happened. My confidence didn't disappear without her guidance. It steadied. I made decisions without rehearsing them. I spoke without bracing for feedback. I failed sometimes and learned without shame attached. Here's what I know now. Honesty without empathy is just control wearing a calm voice. And love that only shows you what's wrong will eventually convince you that you are wrong. If you're reading this and hearing echoes of your own relationship, listen closely to how you feel when you're alone versus when you're with them. That difference matters. Walking away didn't mean I stopped wanting to improve. It meant I finally chose to grow without someone standing over me, red pen in hand.